Hello and welcome to another episode of Staying Connected. Today we have Dr. Luke Wilkins, who's a lecturer at Trobe University in Australia. Luke has had experiences with various sporting organizations and universities over the past few years. How are you doing today, Luke?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Any excuse to talk about this sort of stuff is something that I enjoy doing, so I appreciate it. It's more of a favor to me, I think, than it is to you guys. So.
Yeah, so I actually want to start off a little bit more about your background. So you've done a lot of research on virtual reality. What kind of motivated you to get into this field of study?
Yeah, I guess the motivation to get into this area is because my sporting background didn't progress where I wanted it to get to. So I was very much starting and ending at the amateur level. I loved most sports, and I still love most sports. Played a bit of soccer, played a bit of cricket, but even played a bit of American football at university. But all of this was at a very much at a recreational level. And it was that sort of lack of ability to get better that forced me to sort of go, okay, well, I want to stay in sport. How do I stay in sport if I'm not good enough to play sport? Well, what about understanding sport and learning about sport and teaching sports? So that's kind of what got me towards the academic side of things. After university, I did a PhD under Rob Gray, which I assume, and I imagine most of your listeners will have heard of. Academic at Arizona State University, does lots of stuff in skill acquisition, but also has a huge passion for baseball, does some consulting here and there as well, and obviously does the Perception and Action podcast. If anyone hasn't heard of it, definitely recommend that because that's a really nice bridge between what is sort of very high level academic research, but also very much the applied, how do we use it in real world sport and things like that. So he was my PhD supervisor. Did my PhD under him, which kind of looked at sort of vision testing, vision training in sport. And then after that, I taught a few places, trying to keep this quick as possible, but I was teaching at Newcastle and I was doing a study with writing a paper with Dr. Greg Applebaum, who was at Duke University and is now at San Diego. And basically the New York Yankees reached out to him and said, look, we're trying to hire a cognitive scientist. Do you know anyone? And so it was right place, right time. I happened to be writing a paper with him. He said, what about this guy in the UK? Doesn't know anything about baseball, but, knows stuff about sort of vision and the brain and how we use it in sport. So I interviewed, somehow got the job, and then spent 2 years at the Yankees, which was an absolutely incredible experience, one that I really, really loved. Unfortunately, for sort of family and personal reasons, we couldn't stay there. And so we ended up making the decision to leave America. But the actual job and the position and the people, it changed my life, and I wish I could have stayed there. But I moved back into academia, went back to England. Now I'm in Australia, probably for good now. So in Australia, back in the idea of sort of researching and teaching sports science. So that was a kind of quick, kind of slow tour of my life and my career.
Yeah, it's awesome. I feel like Australia is a pretty good place to live from what I've heard, never been, but it seems like
It's
you
not
made
bad.
a good decision.
I'm not complaining at all.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to dive into a little bit more to your time with the Yankees. Obviously, it's a podcast we talk mostly about baseball. Could you talk a little bit more about your experiences there and even, integrating into a sport that you weren't quite as familiar with, maybe growing up, and how
Yeah.
you use like your different perspective to apply some of your knowledge from research academia into a sporting context?
Yeah. So I got hired as I think it was a vision and cognition scientist. I think that was the technical term. What that meant was essentially how do we test our players on their visual skills and their cognitive skills, and how do we train those skills potentially to improve performance? So we're looking at things like reaction time, decision making, anticipation, looking at things like gaze behavior, things like that. It evolved into becoming a sort of two, maybe even three roles, in that the second role was sort of as a skill acquisition specialist. So teaching and educating and just generally discussing with the coaches, probably as much or more so than the players, about how do we learn skills? What are the principles that, the research suggests are pretty strong in learning skills? And how do we actually put those into practice with our players? So that was kind of the second big pillar of my job that when I was there. And then there was kind of a third one that emerged, which was there's lots of technology in sport these days. Baseball as much, if not more than most sports. We used to get inundated with companies sending us things saying, check out our product. trial it, would you like to buy it, and all this sort of stuff, as you'd expect. And so I kind of became the de facto person to vet all of these emails and all of these companies and all of these products. So that sort of tech research, I guess, became sort of a third role. But the main ones were that sort of vision and cognition scientist and skill acquisition specialist. So really enjoyed it. Like to think we implemented a few things. Coming to your second point, which was sort of, I guess, how do we go from the academic side to the practice? Was that right?
Yeah.
I think for me, a little sort of a get out of jail for me was that you've kind of got to hope that the organization is as welcoming and as open as the Yankees were for me. So I was very, very lucky in that regard. I was very fortunate. I think there's obviously certain things that you can do as well, but many of these are probably quite obvious ones. You can't go in there thinking you know everything and thinking you have all the answers, because a lot of the time you don't even have all the questions when you first arrive. Every organization is different. Every individual in that organization is different. So you very much have to go in there, and first port of call is listening, observing, talking. It's only then that you can actually understand what the situation is, and then you can actually try and maybe change things as well. But the listening, the understanding, the talking, that could be 2-3 months in itself. And that almost sounds as if you're just there doing nothing. But it's such an important role to sort of embed yourself within the organization and really understand what they want and what they need. So
yeah, I know a lot of research generally there's like research from Mark O'Sullivan and other people about like embedding yourself within the club you're in to get a better idea of the social cultural context around it. And I think something in that was, from what it sounds like, in the role that you have with the Yankees, like being able to embed yourself fully before you're able to take action seemed to be a big part of it. And as someone that's lived in various countries now, I'm sure you can even notice some of the differences between American style of sport versus Australian style of sport versus English style of sport. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the differences you see in approaches to skill development country to country. Obviously, in England or in the UK and Australia, it feels like to me as an outsider, there's a lot of energy around skill acquisition, skill adaptation, skill development, and kind of the research there. Versus in America, maybe it's because there's no relegation and pay-to-play models and a bunch of other cultural reasons. There doesn't seem to be quite as much of an appetite for some of this stuff. So I was wondering if you could, speak a little bit to what some of the things you've observed just in your life experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess to start with the point where, from my individual perspective going into the Yankees, I think there were things that helped and didn't help. I think sort of my English accent probably didn't help. You've got people there that rightly probably would be like, okay, what's this English guy going to do teaching us about baseball? Much like, English people would be the same about an American guy teaching us about soccer, right? Like it's not true and it's not valid, but it is a perception that some people will have, and you can appreciate that and understand that. So again, that's just to sort of emphasize that I knew that going in, and it was completely valid, because going prior to the interview, all I knew about baseball was Moneyball. Great film, but that was my knowledge of baseball. So I had to do a lot of learning, had to do a lot of listening, had to do a lot of talking and understanding. So I think there are clearly, obviously, factors there that will make a difference in terms of actually more of a holistic and sort of wider reaching perspective on skill acquisition as a whole. I think historically, America has been behind Europe and Australia. The research shows that, right? Like if you look back at the research, throughout the 80s, 90s, 2000s, it was being produced in Australian universities, British universities, Dutch and European universities, and less so in America, and actually quite a lot in Canada as well, actually, to some extent. But as with pretty much everything in life, America catches up and supersedes people. So it's pretty much, it's very much changing in that regard. Actually, I'm going to reference a study that we produced last year. And we published this last year, where we looked at practitioner perceptions of virtual reality. And we compared baseball practitioners and soccer practitioners. And it wasn't deliberately a cultural thing, but as it is the case, the baseball practitioners were all American and most of the soccer practitioners were European. We initially planned to just compare two sports, but what we were actually doing, I think, is also comparing two cultures and two, you know, types of, sorry, two different samples in that regard. And you do get a difference. So what we found was that the American practitioners or the baseball practitioners perceived their knowledge of technology and their knowledge of virtual reality to be much greater. They perceived there to be fewer obstacles for virtual reality use. They perceived there to be greater opportunity for virtual reality use. And again, I think a lot of that is because baseball is suited to virtual reality, whereas soccer is less so. But it could also be a cultural thing as well, in that maybe there's a more openness and there's a more willing to try and fail in an American culture as opposed to maybe a slightly more safe culture in Europe. That's my hypothesis anyway.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. That's where I think something that we could all benefit from is learning from other sports, and something that honestly I wish I could have the like wide ranging experience that you've had, because for me it's only been baseball in different countries, rather than different sporting contexts, to kind of see where those differences lie, because I'm sure there's things that you can apply from what you learned from working with soccer practitioners. I know you do some stuff with like Aston Villa now, but how that can compare to working with baseball practitioners, for example. And that's a really really fascinating. And it feels like a lot of what we have learned generally, whether it's ecological psychology or virtual reality, the lessons really come from other domains, and we then apply them to sport. So getting some more context to other areas of application can only help with ultimately implementing into sporting contexts. It's
Yeah,
really
100%. I couldn't agree more. And actually, I was so lucky. I mentioned a few minutes ago about how my accent was maybe a disadvantage, but when I spoke to, when conversations I had with my boss during my time there, he was saying that, the fact that you came from England and that you came from a different sport was an advantage for us, was a selling point because you had, a different perspective. You weren't necessarily inhibited by traditions and this sort of 20 years of baseball knowledge that, is obviously very, very helpful and very, very useful, but also maybe sometimes limits you because that is how things are done. And sometimes it's difficult to get out of how things are done and think maybe in a different angle. And I always remember reading a book and it was talking about basketball tactics. And again, basketball's not a sport that I know too well, but they were talking about the full court press and how the full court press was a tactic introduced by someone who came into the sport and didn't really have a basketball knowledge. And they said, okay, well, why don't we just do this? But nobody at the time had considered it because it wasn't the way things were done. And I think that's so true. And the Yankees were very supportive of that. They wanted to bring in people with these different experiences. And I think, there's probably loads of organizations who do something similar, but I've been very lucky in that regard for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think I've heard similar things, whether it's in soccer using like American football for dead ball situations, or recently in football, American football, they talk about wanting their receivers to move like basketball players to the court. And there's just a lot of cross-sport applications that feel like are increasingly being used. That's just awesome stuff. And I'm really glad that you had the opportunity to kind of apply that knowledge and in a space that was accepting of it, which
Yeah,
is really,
absolutely. Very,
yeah.
very lucky. And what you were saying there about a lot of ideas are borrowed. I think that's definitely true. I mean, you can never take the exact plan. You can't pick up and copy and paste an exact plan that you've done with one team into another sport or another team. You can't do that. But the premise of it, the idea behind it, the reasoning behind it, you absolutely can. And that's where, like you said, most ideas actually come from. And um, you reached out about that baseball favor paper published. That's essentially what that is. That is me taking ideas from other areas and putting them into one place and applying them to baseball. So yeah, that's probably a good example of that.
Yeah, to get into that a little bit. So the reason I originally reached out was because of the paper you just released in the Journal of Sports Psychology and Action. It was titled "A Framework for Using Virtual Reality to Enhance psychological performance in baseball, or favor for short in baseball, but FAVR. And yeah, it was released last month. It talked about different use cases for pitchers, fielders, batters in VR, and how it can be integrated into a major league organization. Could you talk a little bit about how the research behind that and the process that went into publishing that paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So I call it the baseball favor paper. Anything with VR, I think is difficult to have a very clever acronym in. So the best I could come up with was baseball favor. So hopefully it works and catches on. The reason this came about was because I still speak to people at the Yankees, still keep in touch with them. And maybe I shouldn't be saying this, I don't know. We can cut it out if need be. I think it's fine. As far as I'm aware, they're not using virtuality at the moment, despite the fact that throughout my time there, probably the biggest project I had was to help develop and implement and run a virtuality project. And so it's a little bit sad for me in that it doesn't seem to be used, because it was my baby in a way, and I'm massively passionate about the topic and the subject. And it's not a magic bullet. It's not going to send a team to the World Series, but it seems mad that teams aren't using it as much as they should be, and aren't using it perhaps correctly in some cases. And so I was thinking, well, why aren't the Yankees doing this? And the reason the Yankees probably aren't doing this is because they don't have that individual driving it. And that individual doesn't need to be an absolute expert in the field. The individual just needs to, have some sort of knowledge, but more importantly, the time and dedication and the effort to give to it, because you can't expect a coach to have all their coaching responsibilities and duties and then also implement a VR training program, or even the sports scientists who are also doing many of the other testing and training that they do. So it needs almost a dedicated individual. And so I was thinking, okay, well, I can't get baseball organizations to hire an individual, but what I could do is maybe put in as literal wording as possible. How do you use VR? When would you use VR? Why would you use VR? And that was this case study. And so the cases are there's 6 cases, 2 for hitters, 1 for pitchers, 1 for fielders, and then 2 for more generic sort of everyone/injured players.
Mm-hmm.
And they are based on things that we either did or strongly discussed and contemplated at the Yankees, but also really importantly, things that are also based and grounded in scientific research and evidence. So, for example, the 5th case, which is essentially what we called psychological readiness, and the things that we referenced were new recruits to the organization. So your rookie level players, your Dominican level players that are coming up to the Florida or Arizona leagues, and then potentially the AAA players going into the big league. So whenever there's a big transition moment in a player's career, what can you do to help them become psychologically ready for that? And virtuality is something you can use, because you can essentially do what they do in clinical psychology and enable what would they call exposure therapy. So show a Dominican Republic player what it's like when they get to the clubhouse in Tampa, what it's like to be in America, what it's like to do all these things that they have absolutely no idea of most of the time. And hopefully doing that, the psychological research would suggest helps reduce anxiety, helps improve well-being, improve confidence, and has all these positive benefits as well. So that's just one example from one case study, but we hope, and I hope, that all of those cases had that sort of real-world application, but very much a scientific background to it.
Yeah, it's actually find it kind of funny that that's the one you drilled in on, because that's exactly what I want to discuss a little bit further. Because I think all of them, in some ways, come back to that idea of preparing individuals for things that they will face in the future, or reflecting on things that they've seen in the past, situations that may come up again. And because I think one challenge that maybe people who aren't as familiar with the baseball context understand is the separation and distance physically between minor league clubs. And so level to level versus it's a lot harder to travel between them, right? So versus if you're at an academy in a soccer academy somewhere, I can go from the U12 field to the U13 field for a day, and then back to the U12 field and kind of get that graded exposure to higher levels. Versus in baseball, just with flights and travel, it's a lot more difficult to go from high A to triple A for a week, right? And also get valuable experience. So I think that's a really interesting idea as a way to kind of, yeah, gradually expose people to the challenges that they'll face in the future. We always say it's impossible to prepare for the third deck in baseball. The minor league stadiums don't have 40,000 people there, but this is a way where you can at least prepare them for some of the situations they may encounter. So I think that's a brilliant idea.
Ah, that's very grateful. Thank you for saying that. And just on that point about the preparing for 40,000 people and things like that, again, we're basing this in research. There is research that shows that you can use VR, you can put individuals in stadiums with crowd noise, with thousands of fans, and it will induce those similar levels of anxiety. So we know VR can do this, and it's probably the only way you can do this, right? You can. How else could you get someone used to being in Yankee Stadium with all the fans around them? Obviously VR is not going to do it to the same level, but it's probably the closest you can ever do. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I always think of, like, I'm a big soccer fan, so like a player making a debut at the end of the last 10 minutes of a game, they're winning or losing by a lot, and that's a great way to do it. You just cannot do that in
yeah,
baseball in the same way. And so that's, yeah, I think it's just really smart and really good. And I think something else that you said earlier to that point is really important, that someone is convicted and has a clear plan on how to implement these things, because otherwise they don't get done. There's a million people doing a million things in large sporting organizations, and exactly like you said, unless it's someone's dedicated responsibility, or there are very clear kind of fail-proof plans laid out, it's just very difficult to get things done. And so I think that's very commendable to put something out like this that hopefully others can follow.
yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. Um, Something too I want to ask about, somewhat in relation to the paper, but you spoke about this in a professional sporting context, like a major league organization. Do you think that some of these ideas, recommendations could also apply to an amateur context? Maybe if it's a smaller club in Australia, or a college university in America. Do you think that these principles also apply there?
Yeah, I think so. And some of your listeners may be surprised at that, but one of the things that we've learned recently, and what we try and emphasize, is that actually the perception of the cost of VR is always higher than the actual cost of VR. Like VR actually isn't that expensive now. You can get headsets for. I'm trying to do the conversion of finances. You can. I'll do it in Australian dollars, and your listeners can do it for me. So you can get headsets for like $400 now, 400 Australian dollars. So whatever that is in US dollars, which, obviously is not a small change, but even smaller organizations might be able to afford that. So the actual cost, again, as we were just saying, is not necessarily financial. It's more, you're taking a coach, you're taking an intern, you're taking a sports science, and you're saying, look, actually, we want you to focus on this a little bit more and help drive this. That's probably the bigger cost, because, as you were just saying, everyone's got so many jobs to do and so many roles and responsibilities in an organization. So I do think it's possible, and I do think you can apply that. The things like again, we'll go back to the psychological readiness example and case study. There are commercial ready-made apps on virtuality where you can use that yourself. Okay. Now, some of the case study approaches, there isn't existing things that you can just buy. You would have to develop that with an organization, a virtuality developer. Now, that's obviously very costly. So there's certain ones which you couldn't do. But for sure, the psychological readiness, to some extent, in terms of baseball, the hitting ones, that is essentially what the Win Reality and the other existing VR companies are doing anyway. So yeah, I think there's definitely things that you can do, and you can you just need to prioritize your workload more so than the finances, I think, to that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know I've heard in the past of people, for example, in the sixth use case, people using like MLB The Show or like a video game to recreate situations for players while to keep them engaged. And I think that VR could be an enhanced way of doing that. But like you said, it just requires you call like the bureaucratical or the organizational focus to get it done, which
Yeah.
is which is
Yeah,
hard.
that's a good one to raise actually, because one of the things that I learned during my time at the Yankees is how much time an injured player has going. You know, you want them doing something and you want to keep them in the team. You want to keep them around the team. You want to keep them around their players, about around their teammates, around their coaches. But what do you do? Like, there's only so many things that you can figure out to do with them. Something like virtuality is something you can give them and say, look, do this. Okay. Even if it's playing MLB The Show,
Mhm.
right? Like, even if it's playing a game, as long as they're not exacerbating their injury, which, all things considered, they shouldn't do unless they do something really crazy. VR can be used almost in that placebo way, almost in that sort of engagement way, just to keep those players around. And having those players around the clubhouse and things like that, that shouldn't be undervalued. That does them a lot of good. And it also, does the teammates and the coaches a lot of good as well. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought up that one.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. So now, obviously, back on the academia side, is there anything that you're excited to research in the future, or something that you're working on now that you can share that you're kind of excited about?
Yeah, loads. How long have you got? Now, the big ones for me, a lot of time I think people think of virtuality as a training tool. And it is, it can be a training tool. For me, the exciting stuff is using it from to understand the mechanisms behind sporting performance and how we do what we do. And this is the use case for the pictures, right? So what we do in that use case for the pictures, for anyone who hasn't read the paper, is we basically we this is for pictures, but actually it's hitters that are doing the virtuality. So by having hitters do certain things in VR, we can understand what allows them to hit, and therefore by understanding what allows them to hit, we can adjust what pitchers do to then circumnavigate that. Hopefully that I've explained that quite well, but I'll give you an example, and that probably is a better way of explaining it. One thing we want to do, and we are currently doing, is exploring manipulation of a pitcher's release point. So tunneling has become a huge, huge thing in baseball. You know this far more than I do. The whole idea of let's try and get releases to pitchers to release the ball, same point every single pitch, and then based on the movement of the trajectory, then the batters can't hit the ball. But actually, there's a potential downside to that, because if you're going to release the ball at the same point every single time, hitters know exactly where to pin their gaze. And being able to sort of see the ball from the release point and track the ball is obviously a very, very important skill for a hitter. So our question was, well, actually, what if you have those surprise release points? So you'll have 5 from the same point and then a 6th one sidearm. And I think there are pitchers that very, very occasionally do this, to my understanding, and there's pitchers that always throw sidearm. But to actually experimentally examine this is pretty much impossible in the real world. You can't have a pitcher doing that. It's one, no coach would allow you to do that to their pitchers because workload, maintenance, and management is so important. So it would be impossible from that regard, even if you did have a pitcher who was good enough to do it. Virtuality allows you to do it. So we're running this study where we're going to examine this and see what effect it does have on hitters. If it has a big effect on hitters, i.e. makes them worse, then what we can do is we can say to our AA players, our AA pitchers, hey, perhaps you incorporate a surprise pitch, a surprise sidearm pitch. Like it might sound controversial, it might sound a little bit crazy, but it could be worth trying. It could be worth seeing if that sort of thing can be done. So
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. Like, I'm excited to see how that goes, because I know we've seen, at least in Major League Baseball, an increase in larger pitch arsenals, so pitchers throwing more pitches than ever, just to have more options, right? And so if you're able to add yet another option to your tool bag, and it's something that can mess with hitters' timing or make them swing and miss, obviously that's very valuable. But like you said, I think that's probably the biggest challenge for pitchers, that they only have so many throws that they can make
yeah,
at a high, right? And so getting those reps in without getting them in could be helpful, especially for a pitcher maybe that is struggling a little bit and needs to find another way to be more effective. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting idea.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I mean, I could talk for hours about it. We've got a few other ones where we mess with the cadence of the pitcher in VR, because obviously it's difficult to mess with the cadence of a pitcher in the real world, at least for scientific purposes. Obviously, you've got Nestor Cortez and people like that that do it every now and again. But again, things like that, how much the ball is visible during the wind up, sort of manipulating things like that. Virtual reality just allows you to manipulate things in a very controlled, systematic, repeatable way. And even if in some cases, in theory, you can do that in the real world, a lot of the time it's very much unrealistic. So that is, for me, that's the most exciting part of VR, not necessarily the actual training elements to it. So
Nice. That's awesome. But yeah, so last question for you is where can people find you if they'd like to reach out or find out more about virtual reality and maybe its applications to sport?
yeah, to be honest, the best thing now is probably email, and I guess you can probably put this on your socials, and you can include my email. I'm pretty good, pretty quick with responding to people. Always happy to chat and discuss things and jump on a call or just chat over email. I used to do Twitter quite a bit, but since Elon took it over and ruined it, I've kind of sort of lost track of that. So unfortunately, I'm showing my age a bit now, but I've kind of like not really on social media as much. Maybe I need to change that, but honestly, email, I'm always happy to. I'm not one of those people that's kind of just ignores emails. So happy to chat with people about that. So
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you, Luke, for joining us. I think I learned a lot, and hopefully all of our listeners learned a lot about how we can apply virtual reality as both a training tool and potentially as a research tool for our players.
that's awesome. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And like, as you can probably tell, I enjoyed chatting about this sort of stuff. So anytime.